This past weekend, me and my partner decided to go to our usual camping spot. It's very low-key, never usually anyone up this mountain besides 1 or 2 people at a time. And even at that time, they're miles away from your campground. It's not a well-known spot. This past weekend, just like every year, we brought my parents' little elderly dog. Set up camp, ate some food, and drank some beer around the campsite. When we arrived, prior to this, we scoped out the area to see how busy it was. There was absolutely nobody in sight. The entire mountain campgrounds were entirely empty. We used to have one hunter or fisher in the area at least. We've never not seen at least one person the entire trip. So we sat around the fire, completely relaxed with my little dog nearby. When we decide to get into bed, my usually very complacent, placid pup refuses to settle inside the tent. It's pretty hot this time of year, so we had the tent unzipped with just the mesh covering the opening to let some breeze in. But my pup was looking through the mesh and sniffing, zoning in on something entirely. We decide to get up and check out the camp for whatever he's looking at. We don't see anything, so we decide to sit by the fire to fire us out when my sleepy pup unsettles suddenly with his hackles straight up on end, growling a deep growl into one direction of the woods. We decided to grab the hunting knife and axe and listen. He's snarling and barking vigorously, which took us by surprise because he's been completely comfortable every other year. After a few hours of him acting on high alert, we decide to flip the truck lights on to illuminate our camp as we're surrounded by darkness. We were listening intently, trying to figure out what he's seeing or hearing. After a few minutes, he lays down and alarms us again a few minutes later, startling us to the point we make a run for the truck by how aggressively my dog is warning something. We wait, hearts pounding inside the truck, trying to see what's out there. After 30 minutes, we assume whatever it is has passed on. After we reposition ourselves in front of the fire again, my dog's hackles are up, and we hear the loudest tree branch snap a mere 10 feet away from us, in the pitch-black wilderness. Again, we hop in the truck with the dog and decide we better leave, as earlier that night we were hearing wolves hunting for a few hours and their howls echoing through the woods. Our main concern was it being a cougar, as they're commonly seen in this area, and there had been a lot of attacks on unsuspecting victims. Our main thought was something was stalking us for a long time without moving on. We told my partner's parents that we decided it's better to be safe than sorry, and we were mocked extensively, but we were armed with very minimal weapons. Not anything that would handle a mountain lion or a pack of wolves. We were called chicken shits the entire weekend and mocked over it. I also felt protective over my dog, as he's very small story too. I was camping in Nebraska, Ohio, by myself. I was on 3rd and final night there, woke up to piss. Walked about 10 feet from my hammock, and noticed a headlamp about 8,100 feet from me. I watched it for about 10 minutes. I watched him stand up, sit down. I got my boots on and grabbed my hatchet and started to walking to the right of my campsite. I was going to find out what he was up to. I got about 50 wide ease from my sight and started walking towards him when I noticed another headlamp, about 40 ft from me and walking around. I hit the ground and threw some leaves on me. He walked about 10 feet from where I was laying. Then he stopped, lit a cigarette, and finished his beer. He threw his can on the ground. After he got far enough that he couldn't hear me, I got up and started walking towards the first guy. I got close enough to him that I can hear his phone receiving messages. I moved up closer to him quietly to where I can see his face lit up from his cell phone. That's when he stood up and started walking towards my hammock. I laid there on the ground for a minute and made my way towards my site. I stopped when I started hearing my tarp that I had above my hammock being trashed. Then I can see flashlights, and then my big flashlight turn on and off. I heard my mess kit being thrown in them talking about how he was just here. I laid on the ground and watched my flashlight walk away until it was a small dim light. When the sun came up and I returned, my whole site was destroyed. My hammock and tarp was shredded by what looked like a machete. My mess kit was stomped on. They took my backpack, rain gear, and flashlight. I went to the spot where I seen the first guy and found chew pouches, 8 empty beer can, and an empty lighter. I walked to where I seen the other guy and found an empty bag of powder, which turned up to be meth, a mess of cigarette butts, and a pile of shit with no toilet paper to be found. A friend and I decided to take our first backpacking trip together. It was late June along the PCT in the North Cascades. The trail still had snow once you hiked above a couple thousand feet. After 3 days of novice snow navigation, we thought we could drive farther south to White Pass and ditch the snow. It hailed and poured half the drive down, so it was a lucky decision and great timing. We parked the car and chatted with a random hiker that keyed asking about our car and our gear. We wanted to know everything about us, and he accidentally overheard me saying he was crazy. He glared at us as we drove away, when we finally started up trail after he left. The weather had lightened up, but it was already around 4 or 5 p.m. The trail was covered in horse manure, until about 1.5 HRs into hiking when we started getting to large patches of snow. We started post-holing, our feet dropping 6-10 inches deep into snow depending on the step. We finally reached where the horse tracks and footprints stopped. Buff had to keep going to find camp. The sun started to set. We began bickering about whether we turn back or keep moving forward. There was no good place to sleep in either direction. We pushed forward and are met with a small clearing where we could set our tents up in the snow. As we finally settle down and get the tents set up, we notice bear tracks through the snow. We start looking at the trees and notice bark is torn off everywhere and they're covered in claw marks. We found bear droppings and different sized tracks near our tents. We freak out realizing we need to hang our food really good and have little time. There is no time to move camping spots. Panicking, we get our food hung, but his has too much weight and the branch keeps bending. The trees are mostly bare and have few sturdy branches. We try until there is almost no time left. In the near dark, he begins throwing large branches around next to a tree to try and cover his food. Something we both knew a bear could get to easily. We hustled to our individual tents and tried texting our coordinates to family, but had no luck. Neither of us had service. We held our knives closely that night. At about 3 a.m., I hear a loud scream and my friend's tent rolling around. In an utter panic, I open my tent flap, shine my headlamp, and there was no bear. His tent fell down in the snow. We laughed harder than ever and slept great the rest of the night. Story 3: my parents and I got lost in Grand Gulch for 2 days. On the tail end of a 5-day trip, we were exiting the canyon. The route seemed a lot more difficult than we anticipated. We knew there would be a faint trail, if any. But once we crested the rim, we found out we were way off course. Knowing the general direction we needed to head, we started walking and conserving water as much as we could, having left the multitude of pockets in the canyon below us. Slept that night under a pinyon pine and shared our last couple power bars, hoping to find some source of water the next day in the open desert. After a few miles the next morning, we finally came upon a faint road that became more pronounced as we went on. This road brought some good feelings, knowing we stashed a shuttle bike for someone to ride the last 8 or so miles to the van. Finally got to the bike cache and my stepdad hopped on as a rainstorm started rolling in. After half an hour or so, it turned to full downpour, which was great because we were thirsty as fuck. After walking what felt like an eternity and wondering where our damn ride was, we walked upon the primitive ass. Empty, other than our van, parking lot. We see my stepdad tearing through it trying to get the damn thing started. A dead battery. He ended up riding through thick mud another 6 miles to the highway to try to flag someone down. Ended up catching the eye of a ranger out patrolling who got us a tow and took us into Blanding, Utah while we got that bastard of a van running again. That felt like a lot for year-old me. Story 4. I should preface this by warning you that my horror story involves food poisoning, so maybe don't read this one over a meal. A few years ago, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles, 8,500 kilometers around much of the U.S. Along the way, I most often preferred to wild camp, simply finding somewhere to disappear into the woods at night, somewhere people were unlikely to find me, and even less likely to care that I was there. And I did this whole trip on my own. It was mid-November in southern Washington state, and I was overall having a pretty unremarkable day just biking all day. But in the afternoon, I started to come down with a bit of a stomach ache. It wasn't bad enough to slow my progress on the bike, but it was certainly noticeable. Even so, I chose to wild camp that night, and as dusk approached, I pretty easily found somewhere to set up camp. After pitching my tent, I went through my usual bedtime routine, using my final few minutes of daylight to write in my journal and brush my teeth before going to bed right around dusk. However, pedaling 80 pounds, 36 kilograms, of bike and camping gear all day, every day is hungry work. I estimate I ate about 4,000 calories a day and still lost a few pounds. So it was a bit concerning on this particular night that I had little appetite for snacking as I went through my evening routine. After turning out my light and laying down, my stomach bug took a turn for the worse. I became nauseous, to the point that I would sit up in bed, hand on the zipper of my tent door, ready to open it up and lean out to vomit. But after sitting up for a long moment, the nausea would fade. and I'd lay back down. A few minutes later, I'd feel sick again. Finally, around 11:30 that night, I threw up. I used some water from one of my 2 bottles to rinse the vomit out of my mouth, drank a bit more water to replenish the fluids I'd lost, and laid down again. I actually managed to get some sleep, but only for 2 hours before I was once again woken by a feeling of nausea. I went through the whole thing again, feeling terrible, sitting up at the ready to throw up. The feeling faded away and then came back. Around 2:30, I finally threw up for a second time. Rinsed my mouth, drank some water, back to bed. Again at 4:30, I woke up. Thankfully, I didn't end up vomiting for a 3rd time, but I also knew I was unlikely to get back to sleep before sunrise. So while I waited for the sun to come up in a few hours, I made new plans. I felt terrible and really didn't want to get back on the bike, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to get back to civilization before my condition got any worse, and also because I'd used up all my water during the night. Thankfully, there was a town about 30 miles 50 kilometers ahead, which is a pretty easy day of biking for me when I'm in good health. And there was a decently cheap motel in that town. So I figured as soon as it was light out, I'd start biking to that town, get a room at the motel, and reassess my condition after a night of better rest. But as soon as it became light enough outside for me to get a move on, I began to hear the soft patter of rain hitting my tent. Checking the forecast on my phone, I didn't expect it to last long, and sure enough, the sound was gone after 20 minutes. Time to make my move. I put my bags outside, took down the tent, and loaded everything onto the bike. Pushed it back to the road, got on, and something felt weird. Getting off the bike, I quickly noticed a flat tire. Just my luck, right? But I had the tools, spare parts, and knowledge to fix it, and so I got to work. In my less than ideal mental condition, the flat took me far longer to repair than it had any right to, and by the time my bike was rolling again, the rain had returned. At this point, I had little other options than to put on my jacket, turn on my lights, and continue on my way. It wasn't even 8:00 a.m., and today was already by far the worst day of the 100 or so I'd been traveling up to that point. I was absolutely miserable. Every rotation of the pedals was a feat of Herculean strength. I was cold and wet. I was tired in every way, sleep-deprived, mentally exhausted, physically aching in every muscle of my body. I was hungry but didn't want to put too much food into my still very upset stomach. And I was dehydrated, as I'd run out of water the previous night. I struggle to recall a time, on my travels or back home, where I felt a more overwhelming sense of hopelessness. But finally, I arrived at that town. After a stop at the grocery store for some food that would be easier on my stomach, I headed to the motel. I got there an hour or 2 before the check-in time, but I must have looked as miserable as I felt, so the receptionist let me into a room early. After a long shower and a phone call home to my mom, I slept for 13 hours straight. The next morning, I woke up feeling much better. It was 60 miles, 100 kilometers, to a bigger city I'd been looking forward to visiting for quite some time. A fairly long day for me, even in the best of health, but the miles ticked by fairly easily, and I made it there by the early evening. The next day, however, the food poisoning would catch up to me while I was out at a museum, and so, the following day, I just took a rest day, staying in the hostel all day with the shits, TMI. I know, but you asked. That got it all out of my system, and the day after that, I was back to full strength. In hindsight, I'm just thankful that the diarrhea waited until I was back in civilization. While riding a bicycle across the country, I came down with food poisoning, the bike broke down on me, and then I had to ride through a cold rain all in one day, 10 tenths. Would still recommend bike camping. Story 1. About 20 years ago, I was driving home from a late wedding DJ gig. I was driving south on a major interstate which was relatively empty at 2:30 a.m. or so. At one point, in the Narrows, the retaining walls on each side get very high as the highway snakes underneath overpasses. Out of nowhere, a young woman jumped down from the retaining wall onto the highway and directly in front of my car. I hit the brakes hard, came to a complete stop, and nearly slammed into her. She looked up, ran to my passenger door, and got in looking terrified. She looked between 16 and 20 years old, long blonde hair, and her clothes looked a little dirty. Not homeless dirty, but like she'd fallen down a few times. "I just need to call my mom," she said. I tried to calm her down and began moving back down the highway, and behind me about 50 feet, I see another figure jump down onto the highway out of my rearview window. I didn't mention this to her, and she didn't look back or see the other person. I sped up and went about 4 or 5 exits south. She kept saying over and over, "I just need to call my mom." This was before most people had cell phones, so I told her I would take her to one of the hour grocery stores and she could call her mom. I asked her if she needed money for a payphone, what was wrong, etc. She said nothing other than, "I just need to call my mom." I pulled up to the grocery store and stopped. She got out quickly but not running, then ducked into the grocery. She didn't say a word to me or look back. I pulled into the gas station across the street and called and told them the entire story and let them know the young woman was inside the grocery store and a description of her. I have no idea what happened. I don't know why she did that, what happened to her, who the figure behind us on the highway was. Nothing. Really made me super uneasy. I think I did the right thing. I would have tried to do more, but she seemed really fragile emotionally and somewhat afraid of me. I am a guy. So I wanted her to just be able to get to where she needed to be. Story 2. I was driving home from a friend's late one evening, probably around 3 a.m. The town I live in and grew up in has a reputation for being a racist area thanks to a few high-profile incidents and a reasonable amount of racist idiots having lived here in the past. As I approached the town, I was going round a roundabout when a car joins, ignoring my right-of-way and cuts me off a bit. It was a shit bit of driving, but I'm reasonably good at not letting that get to me. What was mildly irritating, though, was given how keen the driver was to get out onto the roundabout in front of me. He then drove about 5 miles per hour below the speed limit on the way into the town, and like I said, it's late and I just want to get to bed. About a mile later, we reach the main street of the town, which has many turnoffs, and I'm still sat behind them. They pick one of the quieter turnoffs, which is the one I usually use to get home. At the end of that street, they can go left or right and still end up at the other end of the housing estate. They choose right, which is where I need to go. Then they have a few turnoffs in both directions before hitting another main road. They choose the quietest turnoff, I presume, thinking I'm following them and wanting to see if I actually am, or if I'm just making my way into the main road. Unfortunately for them, they've turned onto my road. They're crawling along it at this point, obviously slightly worried. The driver probably thinks I'm still pissed about being cut off, and I'm following him for some sort of revenge. So they decide to pull in and let me pass. They indicate and pull across a driveway which just happened to be mine. I had to pull alongside them and open my passenger side window. The driver opens his, and there's 3 black teenagers in the car, all looking slightly terrified by the pretty big skinhead, not by choice, white guy who has been following them and now pulled up alongside them in the middle of a quiet estate in an area known for being racist. The look of relief on his face when I said, "Sorry, mate, that's my driveway you're blocking there," was pretty hilarious. Poor kid was scared shitless, but somehow, in trying to get rid of me, made a series of road choices that convinced him he was about to be murdered. Story 3. I was driving along this road that stretches out over about 100 kilometers. It was almost 1 a.m., and I was at the end of the road that is very desolate. Neighbors were kilometers apart from each other. It's a familiar route for me. I drive on it once every few months just to go anywhere. Because of how isolated it is, there's no street lights, so you have to rely on your car headlights. On this particular night, I was feeling a little strange because the route didn't seem familiar, which is impossible because it's just one long road with the occasional turning roads. But I kept driving along towards the place where I turn around. I canned to this certain point in the road where there was one lone house. Their car was parked in the driveway, and I could see that there was somebody in the passenger seat. I thought it was kind of weird because it was so late early. As I got closer to them, they turned the car on and flashed their high beam lights at me. I didn't pay much attention to this, but then I drove past them and looked into my rearview mirror to see what they were up to. They pulled out of their driveway onto the road going the same direction I was. I was a little nervous at this point because it still looked unfamiliar to me. About 5 minuets up the road, I looked into my rearview mirror and the car that pulled out behind me was gone. I looked to my left and noticed an abandoned convenience store on the side of the road. This was something I remember driving past whenever I would drive up here, and I remember that directly in front of the store. A couple of feet away, there's a phone booth. Both the store and the phone booth were run down and covered in graffiti. Neither had been used in a very long time. As I got closer, I saw that there was a dark figure behind the glass of the phone booth. They were looking right at me. I could see their eyes in my headlights. I got a little closer, and they stepped out of the phone booth and started walking towards the road that I was on. I started to speed up, and then this really bright light came on behind me, and this person just took off towards the back of the store. I looked in my rear view mirror and saw the car that had flashed at me earlier. It was about 100 meters behind me. It followed me for another kilometer or so until we reached a turn-off road where it did a U-turn and went back the other way. To get home, I had to go back the way I came. I drove past the phone booth and there was nothing there, and then I reached the house where the car pulled out and it was back in its driveway. Driver still in the front seat. One night, I was out with my cousin just running around. I realized this car had been behind me for a long time and at first was thinking it was a cop, but I was able to determine it definitely wasn't. I started making oddball turns into random neighborhoods, and the car followed me every turn. I literally made a circle of rights, and the car made every right. I still don't know what possessed me to do what I did next, but I told my cousin I'm turning right, and if this car turns with me again, I'm going to do something stupid. I turned right, the car turned right with me, and I immediately turned hard into a gravel parking lot, ripped the e-brake and spun my car around 180 degrees. The car following me immediately whipped around and I started to chase them. I followed them for about a mile until they turned off into an area known for drugs, violence, and gang activity. Another time, it was 6:30 a.m. or so. I was on my way to work on a lane highway. Cruise set at 65, two trucks pass me in the left lane doing 75 or 80. Then one moves to the right and the other car stays in the left a little further back and both start slowing down. I'm a very visual driver, always looking ahead, so I backed off the throttle immediately. They slowed more, and again, not sure what possessed me to do it, but I then hammered the throttle, whipped around the guy in the left lane, and kept my foot down till I lost sight of them. To this day, I have no idea what the intent of either situation was, but I wasn't about to find out. Story 5. I don't often travel at night on my own, because I live in country with a high crime rate. If I travel at night, it is usually with other people, or it is because I have to. The scariest thing that happened to me was when I was a student driving a Mini. I had a friend with me, a girl. I was about 18 at the time. The problem with this Mini was that for some reason, you could not lock it from the inside. It was an old car. You had to get out and then use the key to lock it. It was a fantastic car though, with a lot of power. I had no problems going up a fairly steep hill in fourth gear. What happened was that we stopped at a traffic light. Town was fairly quiet. The next thing was there was a man at my car window trying to talk to me. He was a stranger and older than I was. Instinctively, I just drove through the red traffic lights because I knew he could open that door if he wanted to. There was nobody around as it was late. I drove fast and he went and got back in his car and followed me. There was a second traffic light, also red, and I drove through it turning left and then headed straight to a place where I knew people and possibly police would be. He did not follow me. It might have been completely innocent. But I was not about to hang around to find out. I told my parents about the incident. They said nothing. Within a week, they sold that Mini and my mother gave me her car to drive for a while. It was a car that did lock from inside. It might have been an overreaction by my parents. But then again, my mother had an experience with me as a child that I have no conscious recollection of. She told me we were at the local small shop that sells all kinds of things waiting in the car park, and there was a strange man watching. She instinctively made sure the back door where I was sitting and nearest this man was locked. In seconds, that man grabbed the outside door handle and tried to open it. But he couldn't. He then ran off. It happened so quickly, my mother said. It was just seconds and he was gone. I was very young, so I have no recollection whatsoever. I heard about it, though, when this later incident happened to me. The men involved were different races, so it was definitely not the same person. I think what you can take from these experiences is that you cannot be too careful with girls. Story 1. I had a few roommates when I was living in the dorms my freshman year in college. They were good people all in all, and we had some good times. But as with just about every college experience for most of us, there was one guy who liked to drink a lot. One night, I came home at like 3 in the morning to find our drunk roommate just standing over one of our other roommates' beds, staring at him awkwardly in this odd, Walking Dead-looking stupor. I could tell he was plastered because he was kind of rocking around in silence in the dark. Honestly, it was a bit creepy, so I called out to him in a whisper, "Mike." He turned his head towards me relatively quickly, head bobbing all around, and slowly raised his finger in front of his mouth, and quietly shit me like fucking Elmer Fudd hunting rabbits. He held his finger there for another few seconds, and nearly incoherently muttered, "Fuck this guy." If you could permit me to quickly paint a picture of what Mike looked like, and what Rob looked like, you'll understand why this was a really huge problem. They were as polar opposite as you could imagine, in just about every capacity. Mike was a surfer from Los Angeles. shorter, skinnier kid, with long hair and a stoner attitude. Rob, on the other hand, grew up on a farm and was substantially larger and substantially more fit than Mike, and he never fucked around. Dude was serious, always. Now Mike must have already had it out without me noticing because he was primed and ready to fire without me even realizing what was going on. All I heard was the sound of water hitting cloth, and that's when I saw it. He had started to pee on Rob, who up until that moment was fast asleep. Rob, waking up to what he thought was just warm water, quickly realized what was happening and proceeded to jump out of bed and grabbed Mike, who was still peeing on him up until this point, and threw him across the room, off the far wall. He looked like a fucking rag doll bouncing off the wall, hitting the desk below, and then onto the ground. Mike didn't say a word. He stood up, quietly tucked himself in, and proceeded to walk right past Rob and climb back into his bed. Rob looked at me, looked at our other roommate who was now awake behind me, and looked back at Mike. All of us had this dumbfounded look on our face except Mike, who was, of course, within seconds, already starting to quietly snore. I honestly will never forget the sight of Rob standing there in the middle of the room, with urine dripping down his face, off his shoulders and down his arms, with this absolute befuddled look on his face, as he tried to process what the fuck just happened. I think it angered him more to hear Mike snoring because he angrily turned to his bed and tried to wake him up by shaking him, violently at first, and then hitting him in his back, arms and head. Nothing. Mike was out cold. Story 2: Roommate L landed a job out of town for the summer and found Jay to take over her lease for 3 months. Jay had 2 jobs, seemed responsible, and for the first month or so we all liked her. She was nice, social, did weird things like use toilet paper bizarrely quickly, but otherwise she seemed fine. Roommate R shares the basement with Jay, and R threw a small birthday party for a friend one night. Jay proceeded to invite the entire college basketball and football teams to our small house. Approximately 50 strangers showed up inebriated and screaming all over the neighborhood. The rental manager was called and the uninvited football giants were kicked out. Jay never apologized, and after that we avoided her as much as possible, just waiting for her to move out. About 2 weeks ago, rent was due and Jay didn't pay. Rent is approximately 10% of her monthly income. After rent was late a few days, she offered the excuse that someone had stolen her debit card and cleared out her account, and that she was working with the police and her bank for a refund. Around the same time, R received a Snapchat of Jay wearing one of R's shirts. She had taken it out of R's room. I advised R to check her room for more missing things. She quickly realized that $200 was missing from the opaque black jar she kept tips in. It was hidden in an inconspicuous place. Someone would have had to really search for it. We immediately suspected Jay and set up R's camera to record video while R was at work. I work from home and was there when Jay came home and stole $20 from a jar R had set up in the room. Unfortunately, the camera overheated and didn't catch Jay in the act. Jay was again confronted about her late rent and missed repeated scheduled meetings with rental managers because her mother was in the hospital. Jay told me her mom had tried to kill herself. She told rental managers she had breast cancer. She told a friend her mother wasn't in the hospital at all. She also told friends that money had been stolen from her room and that she had set up a camera to catch the thief in the act. R hid the tip jar in a dirty laundry basket in her closet until she could get to the bank. When she took it out, $300 million dollars were missing. We called the police, and while they couldn't do much, they advised us to confront Jay and get her to confess. Jay was evicted for late rent and given a 3-day notice to exit the premises. She agreed to meet with R and me to discuss the stolen money, but didn't arrive when she'd said she would, as we expected. She snuck into the house later that day. I happened to hear her and cornered her. Calling the rental managers and R, we confronted Jay, and she confessed to stealing over $650 from R and agreed to pay the amount back the next day. Next day she texts R and says she can only pay her $100. R is pressing charges and Jay has been trespassed from our property. It's been a wild few weeks. The worst part of the whole ordeal was how Jay acted. Lie after lie after lie, more unbelievable than the next. She showed absolutely no remorse and kept talking about the situation as if it had been caused by someone else, i.e., "I'm sorry this happened to you." Talking to her, I got the sinking feeling that she didn't have a conscience and that she felt she had a right to the money. It didn't feel like I was talking to an actual person. I honestly feel bad for the girl. She has effectively ruined her life and needs serious help. Too long. Didn't read my compulsive liar roommate stole hundreds of dollars from my other roommate and made our lives a living hell. Edit. At a party this weekend, Jay bragged to several people about stealing the money. Previous roommates have come forward saying Jay stole from them and used the same excuses of her debit card being stolen and her mom being in the hospital. Jay told some of her friends that one of her roommates had stolen $400 from her room and that she had set up a camera to catch them, and her former coworker at a car dealership says she stole a car. Story 3. He is a friend of mine, and he has sleeping disorders. He used to speak while sleeping, and if prompted, he would answer for most questions correctly until he realizes that he is speaking in real. So by this way, we could get truth from him easily if one could sacrifice a night's sleep. And this is the reason he never indulges in any silly or mischievous activities, thinking his roommates would find out easily. One night after we saw Conjuring movie in room with surround sound system, we got frightened and slept on the floor with each other except that guy. The time was around 3 and I was sleeping nicely because of the thought that my friends are sleeping nearby me. Suddenly I heard someone laughing. My spine got chilled and I had no idea to open my eyes ever. But slowly I could sense a shadow kind of thing over my face from someone blocking the light from night lamp, and the laughing started to get heavy. With high heartbeats, I opened my eyes to see a gigantic figure standing over my bed and laughing at me like a ghost. That's it. I screamed like anything along with my friends who were awakened by my scream and got frightened along with me. Our screams woke him up and he realized he's walking in his sleep and turned towards his bed and walked slowly. The rest of the night was longest for all of us except him. Story 4. My junior year of college, I was living with 2 of my good friends. My parents owned the house we lived in and gave us very cheap rent. All they asked in the contract was that we not have any pets over 30 pounds and didn't destroy the house. The first 3 months went great. My roommates smoked a lot of weed, but they always did it outside of the house, so I didn't mind. In November, I went to Bali, Indonesia with 6 friends for a week. When I came back, my roommate had adopted a giant 50-pound pit bull. I was told she had literally gotten the dog the day after I had left. It had been living in the house for a week. I was mad for me and my parents. I told her before we moved in together that I didn't like living with big dogs, that I'd had bad experiences. I couldn't believe she got one behind my back. Plus, she'd signed a contract with my parents saying she wouldn't get a dog over 30 pounds while she lived there. I told her how angry I was, how she betrayed me by doing this while I was out of the country, how she couldn't keep the dog because she'd signed a legally binding contract. She replied saying it was an accident. She went to a pound just to look at the dogs and she came out with one. Apparently it was a kill shelter. She said, "What did you expect me to do, let him die?" I told her she could save the dog, find a new home for it, but it couldn't stay at our house. When she didn't get rid of it for a week, I told her it needed to be gone by tomorrow. That's when all hell broke loose. First, she started smoking a ton of weed in the house every day. My house was a hot box all the time. I couldn't study in my house without getting a high sometimes. She spent so much on weed she didn't have enough for rent for multiple months and had to borrow from our other roommate, her best friend. Next, she started having her drug dealers sleep over in our house. I would wake up to go to class, and her 2 drug dealers were sleeping on a blow-up mattress in our living room each morning. I was terrified of them. Not only that, their drug dealers would have people stop by our house to pick up weed. It was terrifying. I was living in a trap house. I was scared of police coming and getting implicated in a drug bust. She also publicly posted about how horrible I was on social media. I would wake up to a post of a meme with a caption complaining about something I did. All her friends would leave comments about how horrible I was also. She started throwing a lot of mini parties in our house on school nights. I was an engineering major, so I just had to stay out of the house since I needed to study a lot. My parents visited me after that. They were driving through our town, and I had them sit in my living room a while before we went to dinner. Afterwards, my roommate called my parents, threatening to sue them. She said they didn't give 24 hours notice as landlords that they were coming to the house. She said she could, and she would sue them because of it. They were very surprised. They just said we were only visiting our daughter. My roommate also started sending strange handwritten notes to my parents. All of them complained about me. One note detailed how I left a crock pot to soak on the stove and it attracted spiders. Another letter she sent my parents complained about how I left a drip on the stove. These notes complained mostly about how horrible she thought I was as a roommate. At the bottom of every note, she'd sign her name and her phone number saying, "Call me if you have any questions." She literally wrote letters to my parents about her roommate problems. My parents were confused and called her, wanting to explain that they, as landlords, had no jurisdiction over her roommate discrepancies. When they called her, she started screaming at them, literally screaming. She got so upset that she never got a full sentence out and hung up the phone on them. She eventually got so crazy that my parents just let her out of the lease. They didn't want to be screamed at. My parents are very non-confrontational people. Story 5. I am going anonymous because my roommate finds this embarrassing. He doesn't want people to know about this. This happened 2 months back with my previous roommate. We used to share the same room. Let's call him K. This happened at around 1:00 a.m. in the morning. I heard a shrill scream of a woman. I was scared shit and woke up. It had come from the direction where Kay was sleeping. It felt like a lady was in the room itself. I looked around, there was nothing. Kay was fast asleep, there was nothing outside the window. I was scared and could not sleep all night, with a fear that something else was going to happen again. Woke up in the morning to find that Kay had scratched his right hand using his left-hand fingernails. He had dug his nails deep, and he had no idea how he did it. He did not feel any pain till morning. He told me that he watched a dream where a lady was not letting of her, and she held him tightly. He had no idea who she was. He had no explanation for what happened. He had to see a doc for the wound, because it was severe. For a few days after that, I spent few more sleepless nights, expecting something else to happen, but nothing happened, and we never were able to solve the mystery. Story 6. Some nights, she talks to people that I can't see, between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning. We shared a room in one of the university's hostel at the westernmost end of Singapore. The hostel faced a jungle, dense uninhabited areas that the military occasionally uses for live firing exercises. Further up the road, Jalan Bahar, is a large Chinese cemetery. It was a very small and simple room. Just one door, one window, 2 beds, side by side, 2 cupboards, and 2 desks. The first night it happened, I thought she was on the phone with someone. She was asking questions, pausing, laughing. The conversation actually woke me up. Hey, you gotta be kidding me, right? It's 3 a.m. She had her back to me and flat out ignored me. I sat up and stared at her, and that was when I noticed the blinking light on the table. She had left her phone to charge. I peered over her shoulders and saw that she seems to be having a conversation with someone lying beside her. This happened a couple of times, and she always don't remember them when I ask her the next day. The incident that freaked the F out of me was the night she suddenly jolted upright. What in the world? My bed actually shook, and my heart almost came out my mouth. Seriously? I turned around and saw her sitting up, having a conversation with someone who's sitting on one of our chairs. I have no idea why the chair was facing her bed. Goodness. Sleep talking? Sleep walking? I don't know. I asked if she had a history of doing that, but nopes. Back home, she shares room with her sister, and her sis has never complained about her having conversations with people. One last freaky story about my roommate. So this one night, I heard her get out of the bed, which was pretty normal. We get out the bed to go to the toilet outside, or to get water, but she didn't leave the room. I turned around to peep at her, and she was standing at the window. Holy mother of G! I was so afraid she was gonna jump. But what does she do? She talks to someone right outside our window. The hell? Blah, blah, blah. And then she comes back to bed. Story 7. When I was in college in 2009, I was sharing flat with 3 more students who were my classmates. It was 2 rooms flat, 1 big hall and 1 bedroom. We had huge gang in a college, and we were the only non-local students, so our flat was the ADA for whole gang. The gang used to spend whole day on our flat. So let's go to story. Those were rainy days. An incident happened in month of July. It was one of our roommate's birthday, so we decided to prank him by not wishing him for his birthday. We, all roomies and gang, went for outing, but no one wished him on his special day. He was very upset, and we were able to feel his sadness. Whole day was spent on outing, and we came back to our flat at around 9:30 p.m. The gang went their home, not actually, and we roomies set our beds and watching some horror movie lying on bed. The birthday boy was also watching movie with us, but he was so upset that he preferred leave movie in half and go to bed. The birthday boy was sleeping alone in bedroom with his loneliness, and it was around 11:30 p.m. We confirmed that he is in deep sleep. We immediately called our gang who were waiting outside with cake. Gang came in. Lights switched off. birthday boy still in deep sleep. One naughty fellow brought a scary mask with him. He put on the mask and sat in front of him. The whole gang shouted at the same time, "Happy birthday, Baba, bro." And he opened his eyes and saw a masked ghost staring at him. He was so scared, he actually peed in his pants. He was so damn scared that he was not able to speak for some time and was behaving weird. Looking at his condition now, it was our turn to wet our pants, but somehow we succeeded to calm him and brought him to normal. This was nightmare for him and for us as well. None of us have forgotten this incident, and I'm sure none of us will ever forget it. Till date, we have never forgot to wish him on his birthday. Story 8, it was a perfect setup in the room to scare the shit out of someone if you wished to. Lights off, except a study table light, just enough to let you acknowledge a presence in the room. My roommate was fast asleep. I double-checked, as he had a habit of jumping me when I watched such movies. Cutting to the chase, there's this scene where the actress wakes up in her bedroom to discover someone roaming in the balcony. At that precise movement, I see a figure pass by the study light from the corner of my eye in the same direction. I immediately hit pause and move my arm around to check if my roommate is the one roaming around. But no, he is still there sleeping. Might be an overthought. Still, a part of me hangs on to the possibility of a ghost in the room. Hit play. The ghost in the balcony moves back and forth once more, and with a really wicked background sound comes back. But inside the room this time. This is when the shit gets real. The figure again passes back against the study light, and I check on my roommate with my arm to find him asleep again. The small part that believed now takes over and I stay still, waiting for him, or it, to pass back. Nothing happens. Once again, roommate still asleep. I carefully lay back, and as I am about to resume the movie, I feel a hand on my shoulder with a nasal voice calling my name. Druval? I swear the adrenaline rush in my body at that moment could bring a dead man back to life. Then I hear again, story 9, this was my first night with my new roomie. Lights were out as he went to sleep early. There wasn't much to do as the classes were yet to begin. I opened up my laptop and began searching for the movies I could watch. Long time, no horror movies, I thought. And voila! My eyes stopped on Drag Me to Hell, did my usual analysis on IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes, and found that this could be a good watch. I started the movie and it was going well. Some little scary scenes here and there, and in between I was keeping an eye on my roomie sleeping next to me to make sure the light wasn't disturbing. But all was well since his back was facing me. Then out of nowhere came the scene which according to me was the scariest of the movie, especially because of its timing. What happened next is the scariest moment of my life. I hadn't realized when my roomie had changed his posture and was facing me now. So just when this scene came, it prompted me to look away from the screen towards him. What scared the shit out of me was that he was sleeping with his eyes open, only the white part visible, and his tongue out of his mouth. I just removed the earphones and ran out of my room. With time, I realized this is how he always slept.